This podcast is a recording of an event that the New Arab chaired alongside Haymarket Books to celebrate the launch of the book Palestine in a World on Fire by Ilan Pappé and Katherine Natanel, hosted at Reference Point in London on the 4th of April 2025, chaired by myself, Benjamin Ashraf. In it, we discussed the movement for justice in Palestine and its undeniable connection to movements for freedom around the world. And some of the thinkers brought up in the book are Angela Davis, Paul Gilroy, Judith Butler, Noam Chomsky, Nadine El-Enany, who joined us on the night, and others in a collection of interviews on what it means to build and maintain solidarity with Palestine. We hope you enjoy.
We'll begin the discussion now, and as you can see, it's a packed out crowd, and it sold out in a couple of days, and it's just a reminder that Palestine, as Ilan wrote, is still the issue. And you know, the urgency and the appetite, not only to understand the question of Palestine, but to understand the extent of Israeli settler colonialism, and also the intransigence and complicity of Western nations is greater than ever. So thank you for spending your Friday evening with us. You know, in these harrowing, in this bleak moment, we need to be very clear about who we are. And I'm reminded of the great sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. When he was 89, he embarked on a trilogy of novels. I don't know if I'll be doing that at 89, but called The Black Flame, in which he remarked, he said, "I've been searching for these questions for 89 years and I've yet to find adequate answers. And these questions are, how does integrity face oppression? How does honesty face deception? How does decency face insult? And what shall virtue do to meet brute force?" I'll repeat them because I think they're important. How does integrity face oppression? How does honesty face deception? How does decency face insult? And what shall virtue do to meet brute force? Now, I'm sure every day when you look at your Instagram or social media or reading the newspaper, you can see that clash very vividly. And so we need to be very, very clear about the choices, the virtues, and the visions we seek to enact and embody. And so that's why, having read the book, Palestine in a World on Fire, with keen interest, it really is a privilege, because I know full well, having read the book, that Katie, Nadine, and Ilan have fleshed out a future where justice, liberation, and self-determination is possible, not only in Palestine, but beyond. And so, yeah, it's great to be here today, and I'd like to say a few thanks as well now. So Miles Howard from Haymarket, who without him this event wouldn't have been made possible. Also the Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, and the Decolonizing Network reference point for hosting us here today, and the New Arab. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with our work, but we were set up 10 years ago by dissidents and revolutionaries from the Arab Spring. This was a time when no one was really speaking about Syria, and so the last 6 months has been a whole whirlwind. But just for you to understand our editorial line, we understand that the democratization of the Arab region doesn't happen without Palestine being free, because Israel is almost a negative feedback loop. It's what, as Ilan and we had the pleasure of working on an opinion piece last year. The title was "To End the Gaza Genocide, Uproot the Source of All Violence, Zionism." And that really gets at the heart of what we're facing. And so that's a bit about the New Arab, but we are very clear in our dictionary. I'm sure you've seen even The Guardian or BBC, they're very careful with the way that they phrase things. But we're very clear. Israel is a illegal settler colonial expansionary force that's currently committing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, genocide in Gaza, and apartheid in historic Palestine. This language really matters. We have to keep repeating it. And not only does it matter, it's grounded in international law. And it helps, as Nadine works show, it helps demythologize a lot of these narratives and stories we're told of Israel being this secular, democratic, human rights abiding state. So with the work of the New Arab and others like it, it's really important to keep pushing this door down. And Palestine in a World on Fire is yet another reminder of that. Just before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to speak a little bit about the title because I thought it was really interesting. Palestine in a World on Fire. Palestine in a World on Fire. And as Ilan and Katie will explain when we talk a bit about the book, it was written during the summer of 2020, and it was a summer of upheaval. It's the peak of COVID-19. You had the protests for Black Lives happening at the same time. And, I started to think about it because I was like, well, there must be some link. For the writers in the room, we know that fire is quite like an elementary metaphor. It really strikes at the heart of the human condition. But there was something deeper, and I was thinking, and it struck me that there was. In a fire, the main cause of death is asphyxiation. And COVID-19, the main symptom is a shortness of breath. For those that have been to Palestine those that live there, they know that on a day-to-day basis, the overriding feeling is one of suffocation. And of course, George Floyd's last words were, "I cannot breathe." So not only is the world on fire, but it strikes me that breathlessness is surely a lasting metaphor for the globally oppressed. And so this is where we're at. And I'd now like to introduce the speakers. To understand Palestine is to understand the world, and to understand the world is to understand Palestine. And I think Katie and Ilan write it so well in the introduction, where they say we can only really deal with this nexus of climate denial, capitalism, imperialism, and I quote, unless we overcome and through a commitment to learning our histories, developing new languages, and questioning how things work. Palestine in a World on Fire offers our belief that words, stories, and dialogue can play a role, modest it may seem, in creating a future where knowledge does not fan the flames of injustice and devastation, but serves the aims of justice and liberation. So I'm delighted to welcome our speakers tonight. On my immediate left, well, everyone's on my left. No, it's fine. It's fine. So my first left, Katherine Natanel is a senior lecturer in gender studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. She is also author of Sustaining Conflict, Apathy and Domination in Israel-Palestine, and serves as the executive editor for the Middle East Research and Information Project. Next to Katie is Nadine El-Enany. She is professor of law at the University of Kent, where she teaches and researches in the field of migration law, EU law, protest and racial state violence. She is the author of Bordering Britain, Law, Race and Empire, and her writing has appeared in various media outlets. And finally, last but not least, Professor Ilan Pappé, who is Professor of History and the Director of the European Centre of Palestine Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Also, he has written 22 books to date, including Our Vision for Liberation with Ramzi Baroud, On Palestine and Gaza in Crisis with Noam Chomsky, and the bestseller, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. So if everyone could give a big round of applause to our speakers today. So Katie and Ilan, if I may start with you, I think congratulations is in order. And I was thinking on the tube ride up that when I was younger, I was always fascinated with footballers and their stance on Palestine. So I'd Google when I was younger, I'd be like, Cristiano Ronaldo thoughts on Palestine. But obviously when you grow up, that Cristiano Ronaldo becomes Paul Gilroy. And you have all these, big heroes. So it feels a bit like a star-studded, real coalition of voices. And so I think, we'll get into them, but it's a list. Angela Davis, Noam Chomsky, Yanis Varoufakis, Judith Butler, Mustafa Barghouti, our own Nadine El-Enany. The list goes on, and I'm sure we'll touch on their work as the discussion unfolds. But I'd like to start by just taking you back. It's nearly to the day, actually, 5 years ago. We were in the time of COVID-19. This was when neoliberal excess, financialization, militarization, great health inequalities. Also, Black Lives, as I mentioned earlier, you've got, re-energized debates around decolonization, structural racism, and reparations. So, but it also was something. There was lots happening in Palestine, and in the years prior to the book's creation, you had the nation-state basic law, entrenching apartheid in Palestine. Then you had the Great March of Return. Then in September 2020, you had the Abraham Accords. And you had, during the book, actually, you had the Sheikh Jarrah expulsions and the flare-up at Bab al-Rahma in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, leading to the assault on Gaza. So, I want to start by saying, can you just tell us a bit about the format of the book, the unique nature of it? How did these contributions, come about? But also, as I was touching on, is that things were happening in Palestine in the background. But why did you both feel that you needed to re-energize the conversation in Palestine in such a way?
Go ahead. Okay. First of all, good evening, everyone, and I want to extend my thanks to the organizers, to MAP, to New Arab, to the Institute, to Nadine that spends the evening with us. Thank you. There were certain kind of circumstances that fused together to create this moment for us, for Katie and myself, and deciding to go on that project. And it went longer than 1 year, so we didn't know exactly how it will end when we started. But the idea was the following. There was a sense that the University of Exeter is ready to accept decolonial studies as a topic that would get the blessing of the establishment, let's call it that way. That was one thing. And so we knew that students would like to hear people they usually read and don't meet, and to humanize the books and the articles. And there's a difference between reading an article by someone and hearing a conversation with someone. So the first thing I think was, since there is a focus on decoloniality and decolonizing knowledge, and particularly the black experience in the United Kingdom, of course the events you mentioned in the United States, and our very, very focused interest on Palestine, we felt it all actually fell together into a moment where you can have a discussion about global issues, but ones that are totally relevant to Palestine, or you have a conversation on Palestine, which is very relevant to issues that are global and regional for that purpose. I think that it really, I mean, Katie would correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we didn't have, at the beginning, we didn't have a very structured idea about how it will develop. It actually started by everyone in the university looking for the phone number of Angela Davis. And I was the only person in the 30,000 people who are populating the campus in Exeter who had the number of Angela Davis, which was a very powerful a moment in my life. And I took my time before I was willing to depart with the number and allow them to call her. And she didn't answer that much, did she? So I called her myself, and I realized that she's willing to join us in a conversation. And then we realized that a lot of people Katie and I, admire, are reading, thinking about, talking about with us, between ourselves, with the students, are actually very focused on Palestine. And this was at a time that no one, remember that's before the 7th of October. Nobody was focusing on Palestine. Ukraine took over. Before the pandemic took over, Palestine was totally marginalized as a topic of interest, of moral interest, political interest. And but it was clear to us that there are very important people who are very articulate, who already made huge contributions to decolonizing knowledge and so on, for whom Palestine is still a very central issue. And then we started with Angela, but then we understood that there's a long list of people who it will be worthwhile hearing what they think about Palestine at a time that Palestine has been totally expunged from the media agenda, from the political agenda. Again, remember this is the years where Palestine was hardly featured in the news, in the conversation, and so on. So that was the first, I think, kind of motive to bring that together. But once we started talking to people, they mentioned other people. And then we thought, oh, maybe we should also talk to other people from different angles and perspectives. And it brought to the fore, and with this I would end and let Katie to complete the story. What came to the fore was that actually was the gap between the world, Katie, myself, Nadine, probably you, and the people we talk to live in, where we're thinking about Palestine, where we see the connection between injustice around the world to injustice in Palestine. So you can have this free conversation without any preparatory, kind of comments, without the fear of they're not balanced, without thinking that you're walking on eggs. This world and the other world, the world of the people who unfortunately have the power to change the reality, who do not speak our language. Palestine, at best, is something that they ignore. At worst, that they are complicit in its destruction. And from a powerless position, we thought, at least let us see who are the allies. In the world of activism, academia, intellectualism, we didn't think that we are creating the new alliance that would change the world, but it was not a good moment to be alone. And it was not a good moment to speak alone, or just with one or two persons, in a language that people in the mainstream media and academia would find political, offensive. Later on, they would define that language as anti-Semitic and racist and pro-terrorist and so on. So it was an empowerment for the moment, with the hope that maybe also some people will give us ideas of how to even expand this experience beyond these people. And of course, we didn't include everyone who had something important to say on Palestine. Thank God there are many people, but we had to somehow decide who will be there or not. But the idea was really to make the point that Palestine is the epitome of injustice, whether it's ecological injustice, whether it's social injustice, whether it's moral injustice, to make the point how complicit, and we really had no idea what's going to happen in 2023, but if you read what we are talking about, it's if we knew that this was coming, because we were talking about the need to talk about the complicity of the West in general, and particularly Europe and Britain, in what goes on, and the connection between the lack of freedoms and rights in the Arab world, in the global South, in the global North, and the injustice in Palestine, sort of bringing it all together into a conversation by people who really devoted, many of them, many years for articulating these connections, understanding them, and being very honest what they still could not decipher, and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Ilan. And it's always just such a pleasure to listen to you and to think with you. And thank you to everyone for being here this evening, coming from locally and much farther afield. And to Ben, the way that you spoke about the title and fire and breathlessness it's really, that will sit with me a long time. So thank you for that. I think with Ilan, I want to pick up on the points of connection and the feeling of not being alone. And to say that it was an amazing moment when Angela Davis did reply to you, and we were all like breathless and just didn't want to get whatever wrong that we were about to do with that opportunity. But there was a real sense among the people who were invited personally by Ilan to enter into these conversations and exchanges that they were eager. It wasn't even that they were willing, I think was the word that you used, but they were really eager to speak about Palestine, and many of them actually hadn't had that opportunity before, hadn't had the platform, and certainly hadn't been asked questions from Ilan, an acclaimed historian and historiographer, an activist, organizer, educator. So there was this appetite, almost a hunger among the people that you spoke with, to speak and to think with you and to be heard as well. And that feeling of not being alone and that opportunity for connectedness, you didn't, and I wouldn't underestimate how significant that was for many, many people, particularly in the time at the height of COVID. And in the introduction, we speak about how this time of actually physical isolation and real loss, real worry and death and destruction. Again, we're living this differently now, but that time of isolation in particular yielded these platforms for exchange that were somehow intimate as well. So we used Zoom as the primary platform, and we were able to have 300 people in a room with us. But we also live streamed to YouTube. So for the case of Angela Davis, we had 300 people in the room with Zoom and then 400 people live streaming. And watching the live stream, and it was just incredible because at the same time, that was an expansive global space that held a very intimate conversation. And that pattern, I think, was repeated. Never did we quite reach those audience numbers again, but that pattern was repeated. And for me, I was involved a lot in a lot of the logistics. So talking to personal assistants and business managers and getting schedules aligned and doing various technical things as well, which I'm really happy to do that. But one of I think one of the things I found most gratifying in the setup for each conversation was Ilan sending me the questions and the themes that he was going to engage a given speaker on. And we would go back and forth on some of the points, but from that list of questions, which were thick as you read the book, these are not questions. These are
surveys.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're absolutely each one contains such wisdom. It's really incredible. But from that, I would distill the theme, which would be basically the abstract or the pitch that then people would read and sign up, register for Zoom. But that theme, or that small paragraph, about 200 words, would also guide, and obviously the conversation questions would guide the speakers in preparation, but also understanding how it was that Ilan intended to or hoped to bring them into conversation about Palestine. And it's interesting, in the introduction we write that Palestine was an entry point at that time for thinking about and talking about climate change and neoliberal capitalism and imperialism and various other fires. But over time within the series, that process of re-energization and the unfolding of particular events, including the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, really re-centered Palestine as the center, as the focus, not just an entry point, but as the point, as you've said as well. So I think those are parts of the format and the overall, the broader process of the conversation series coming together, that it all works together. It all worked together over those 2 years. But also the last point I wanted to add was that I know in the questions every single time you ended on a point and an invitation for each speaker to offer some words of guidance and reassurance, really, to the students who are coming through higher education systems around the world, who are pursuing research agendas, who are trying to bring their scholarship. I'm looking at Gabrielle here, who's one of those amazing students. They're bringing these incredibly critical research agendas, bringing together scholarship and activism, being publicly visible and audible. So you asked each speaker to offer reassurance, to offer guidance, to show them a light and a way forward. And to me, that's such an important part of the conversation, which then resulted in the way that the introduction is written, containing 6 lessons. We wanted to build a toolkit. And part of this was also, again, thinking about the larger process based on feedback from our first reader, Bill Mullen from Haymarket, who we had this quite lengthy, treatise into Palestine studies. And he was like, great, but could you give us something that's we can use? And I think that's a really important part of the format.
Can I just add something? I forgot to mention, one of the contexts we were working was prevent. I don't know if all of you know what prevent is. Those of you who don't know, that's God. You're the legal person. Nadine will explain what prevent is. Basically, I can see it's an attempt to silence people talking on Palestine, but that's an interpretation. It's not it's not the word of the. It's pretty much what it reduced to. So a little did we know how much this campaign of silencing people talking on Palestine would be upgraded after the 7th of October into levels that we didn't anticipate. It was bad enough when we did it. So one of the reasons we talked, we wanted to have encouragement for students and faculty to say, and to be honest, if you'll talk openly about Palestine, you are taking risks with your academic career. If you are a student on a visa, you are taking a risk that your visa would be taken away from you. Again, we didn't know how bad it will be as it is now, but we thought that there was something important to be said by these people, and hopefully we actually also wanted them to be the network that would help to protect vulnerable people who are intellectuals, academics, and activists, because already then in 2020, it was clear that there is a powerful mechanism that tries to silence people on Palestine, that did not allow the use of a certain language, and so on. So I think it's also important to understand, this is the alliance I was also talking about. I mean, we need a sort of a shield of immunity of a kind, as much as one can, because we are fighting establishments and governments and security services who are much more powerful than we are. And now they are entering the battle with us on language, on our thoughts, on our moral positions. So we need all the moral authority from anyone we can get to be able to survive that kind of offensive.
Absolutely, and I think there's a couple of things I'd like to just draw out there. Firstly is this idea of the gap, and you saw really with the appetite of people, really needing that avenue for them to understand Palestine better, and yet, like you said, there was nothing. There was nothing. And so it's a weird book in a way, because it reminds me of Cornel West saying, it feels in time but off the beat. It's like it's a jazzy type book, because it's like it's slightly dissonant, and that's how it works, because even in the afterward, Al-Aqsa flood, October 7th, happened during that time. And I was thinking about this because Miles and I were wondering, when do we actually do this event? And I was saying to myself, well, it could have been when you first finished the book. It could have been like in the middle of genocide last year, and then the ceasefire that never existed, or now. So it could have happened at any three of these points. And Ilan, you talk about this kind of foreshadowing of events, and that's precisely that. But I think crucially, the thing I like about the book is that we've seen so much coverage in which, all coverage treats October 7th as happening in a vacuum, and the book doesn't. And that's because, as Ilan says, you've got you're standing on the shoulder of giants. You've got Elias Khouri, who's had an intimate knowledge of Palestine, Mustafa Barghouti, Angela Davis. These figures have really dedicated their lives to understanding Palestine, or affiliated knowledge systems. And so I think the book is a reminder not only of the longevity of the struggle, but of the plurality of the thought that sustains it. And I'd now like to bring Nadine in, because Nadine's Bordering Britain, which everyone should read, by the way. It's an excellent book. Your work looks at myths, and I find that this is really interesting. We were talking a bit in the introduction about the myth of Israel being a secular democratic state, and your work looks at Britain as this post-imperial, rule of law abiding state that uses immigration law and other means to I guess pressure all of us. So I wanted to ask, Ilan mentions prevent, and there are ways in which Britain uses its law to suppress thought. So do you see a relationship between these ideas of myths between Britain and Palestine, and what's the importance of breaking those myths down?
Thank you. Firstly, I just want to say it's a real honor to in the book and in the conversations. And I'm sorry that out of the list of glittery contributors, you're stuck with me. No, it's seriously, I mean, who wouldn't want Angela Davis on this sofa right now? So, you know, I don't have a PA, and my number was not in Ilan's phone, but for different reasons. Angela Davis is not being on other people's phones. But I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. The book is amazing, by the way. Like, I actually love this book, and I love reading it. And one of the really special things about it is that the conversations are there. That it's so easy to engage with and lose yourself in, because you can hear the voices of these speakers. It's so natural, and it's one thing I love. I wish all books were written actually as conversations and not as kind of footnoted academic text, because it's so much more of an engaging read. You can really lose yourself in these conversations, and I absolutely loved reading it. And also, like Katie was saying earlier, the questions are not questions. It's not a Q&A. It's a deep engagement with the work and ideas of each of the people that feels such an honour if you're on the receiving end of a question like that, because it's actually like having, you know, a kind of deeply thought essay on your work, and then you're invited to respond. It's very special. You know, of all the things I've ever been invited to do, I think this is definitely the most special. So, you know, I really recommend people read the book and share it with others. So yeah, on myths. So yeah, what I did try to do with my book, Bordering Britain, was to break this myth of Britain being a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state. So this idea that, you know, people talk about colonialism in Britain, but it's normally reduced to a conversation about, well, what's in the British Museum that we ought to return. It's kind of on that level, but it's not understood as being something that is very live. And what I talk about in the book is actually Britain being a domestic space of colonialism, where actually we see colonial legacies of racism being enacted all the time on bodies of racialised people, whether we look at Grenfell Tower fire, whether we look at the wars waged by Britain abroad, whether we look at disproportionate stop and search, or people who disproportionate deaths, black people in custody. So we can see the way in which Britain remains a colonial space. But what I wanted to show was actually that this idea that immigration law is fair, or that this idea that Britain has a legitimate state sovereignty is right and proper, which a lot of violence obviously happens on the back of this notion that Britain is a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state, and therefore can exclude racialized people, can leave people to die at sea, is based on a myth. Because actually what I tried to show by looking at immigration law is that it's I argue that it's a continuation of colonial violence. So what we see in the 60s and 70s and 80s is Britain moving from a position where racialized colonial subjects and citizens could travel to Britain. They were never welcome. I mean, that's another myth. The idea that, you know, at one point Britain held its arms open wide to people. In fact, Britain always, Britain never expected, when they passed the 1948 British Nationality Act, which essentially rolled out British subjecthood across the colonies, that people would actually come, because the movement was outward. We had settlers. We had white British settlers going to Australia, going to New Zealand, going to South Africa, and settling. That was the movement. When people began to arrive in the 50s, 60s, this caused real disturbance to the government, and they tried to do everything they possibly could to stop people from travelling. But at that time, the empire was still an important economic entity, one that obviously allowed Britain to extend its power globally, politically as well as economically, and so people were, let's say, tolerated. But in the 60s and 70s, 80s, when Britain began to essentially be on the receiving end of liberation movements, independence movements, and the empire was being defeated across the world, Britain had its eyes on wealth elsewhere, and it was turning to Europe, and it was thinking, you know, how else can we now cement our global power? Maybe Europe is the future rather than this empire. And they began to pass laws that would prevent people from coming to Britain. racialized Commonwealth and colony citizens, and they always had exceptions for white New Zealanders, Australians, and South Africans to be able to come to Britain. So what you can see here with this immigration legislation is what it was actually doing was simply by preventing people from being able to come to Britain, those people who had their lives, their land, their psyches, their future stolen from them in the course of colonialism, were then sort of robbed this final time of the ability to basically come to Britain and essentially take back what is theirs. So if we begin to see immigration law as not as this kind of fair system for determining, who is deserving of coming to Britain and who isn't, but actually as this sort of final seizure of colonial wealth, then we can't say anymore that Britain is a legitimately bordered sovereign nation state. And so that's how you begin to challenge this idea that Britain, can legitimately do the things that it does. And then on the other hand, as you were talking about, what are the connections with Israel? It's like there we see, of course, this myth again that Israel is a democratic state. And we heard this again, was it yesterday when Netanyahu was visiting Hungary, and he's saying, the ICC is anti-Semitic for issuing, the International Criminal Court is anti-Semitic for issuing an arrest warrant. How can you issue an arrest warrant against a democratically elected leader? So this kind of peddling of this idea that Israel is a democratic state, and therefore any action taken against it or criticism is anti-Semitic or is preposterous. How could this? That sort of language. We've seen it so often over the course of decades, but certainly over the past year and a half, we've seen it in a way that it becomes just impossible to hear anymore. A state is committing genocide and saying, well, we're a democratic state. How could you accuse us of doing anything wrong? But there's a lot of purchase for that notion. You see people are a little bit uncomfortable about criticizing a democratically elected leader, and there's obviously so much mythology around Israel, which I won't go into, but this idea that it's a democratic state, I think this particular myth is really powerful. And people end up sort of saying things like, well, it's bad, but I guess it has to happen. We have to live with it. But I think what we end up obscuring is the kind of solidarity that we really need if we want to support and struggle with Palestinians for liberation, because you can't recognize a liberation movement unless you recognize oppression, and you can't recognize oppression if you think that you're dealing with a democratic state. You have to recognize it, as you were saying earlier, as an apartheid state, as a settler colonial state, as an oppressive state, because once you recognize the oppression, then you can say, well, then there's a liberation movement that we can support. And so this is the violence of that democratic state, by delegitimizing and allowing Palestinians to be called terrorists. The amount of times you hear, oh, Israel struck terror targets, and these are schools with people sheltering. These are, and international law obviously has a role to play in this, but that's another subject. But this idea that it's fine to, target civilians if they're being used, which obviously Israel really jumps on this as being, the justification. So yeah, I mean that's I think what we need to recognize about these two sort of the connection between how mythologies essentially delegitimize kind of resistance movements and our capacity for solidarity.
Absolutely, and I think as well that to bring it from the national to the international, you say beautifully that international law often obscures the realities of state violence, and so I want to just, Nadine, if we stay on that law, because you mentioned Viktor Orban, and it was interesting that one of the, I think Ilan's final question to you in the book was about the role of international law, and since then, of course, we've had South Africa take to Israel to the ICJ. You've had Karim Khan issue arrest warrants, but most human rights lawyers that I speak to are speaking to Leilani Farha. Yesterday she called it a farce. In the book, Noura Erakat calls it a colonial shield. So I know you're not a international human rights lawyer, Nadine, but I was wondering if since the time of your conversation with Ilan and now, if anything has changed, or do you feel any more optimism, or is it more of the same?
Oh God, I definitely don't feel more optimism. I mean, you know, if international law was ever going to have its moment to shine, this would have been it. You've got a televised genocide being broadcast, and apparently you can still mince your words around whether or not this is something that is permitted or not. I mean, that's what we've seen. International law is over. It's finished. I mean, there is no prospect for its respectable return. It's been completely shamed. And I mean, I was skeptical, as you can see from the book before. I mean, it's not as though we've seen other... It's not as though Tony Blair or George Bush have ever been brought before the ICC. We knew it was, forgive me, bullshit before. But like now, I mean... can we really see a place for international? I mean, and that's just, you know. And then of course you think about the international laws of war, and you think how they're constantly being abused in Israel, hiding behind this idea that you can bomb civilians to pieces because you just make the argument that they are, you know, mixed in with fighters, and then they're legitimate targets, and therefore you can. This is the thing, and you know, Neve Gordon makes this argument. This is international law basically licenses what we're seeing happening at the moment. So no, I'm absolutely not more optimistic. I mean, I get why. I have a lot of respect and appreciation for people using the law in these ways and trying to kind of. I guess that raises awareness. It creates some sort of diplomatic stage or political stage where these things get played out and people, but the law itself has not managed to change anything.
We've seen it with the reaction of Western nations with just how flippant.
Exactly.
There's nothing.
Yeah.
Ilan, Katie, if you wanted to jump in on that at all.
Just one thought that came to my mind about the racializing immigration and the fact that history is sometimes more structured and cyclic. And the connection between Zionism, racialized immigration policy, and the fact that Europe, including Britain, has never really dealt with racism by thinking that the most important racist issue between the two world wars was solved by imposing a European nation state on the heart of the Arab world and the heart of the Muslim world. In other words, one of the main reasons the Anglo-Jewish and also the Christian aristocracy in Britain in the late 19th century supported this idea that the best solution for what they would call the Jewish question, namely the fact that Europe didn't know how to deal with anti-Semitism, was to build a European Jewish state in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinian and impose it by force on the Arab world. One of the reasons that they went for this kind of a project was the fear from the Jews, I can call them the black Jews. These are the Jews of Romania, of Russia, that not only Lord Balfour, who passed laws against these people coming into Britain, but also the Anglo-Jewish aristocracy did not want them in Britain. And it shows the connection, namely, if you allow racism to determine immigration laws, the groups that are being racialized may change in history, but the very structure of racism as being the most important factor in determining how to treat life seekers, work seekers, and so on, remains the same. This is so important for Zionism because it's the essence of the problem we have today is that you needed force to impose a European Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world. You needed force to sustain it. And you need more force after the indigenous native people resisted. And that's where we are. So we are still in this historic, it's 120 years ago, but we're still in the same historical moment of the need to use force, ruthless force, in order to solve a European problem. And Europe not only did not solve the problem of anti-Semitism, it didn't solve the problem of racism because of that. And that is the connections which I think are also there between immigration policies and practices, which maybe we should even stress more and more to take the Palestine issue out of its local context and make it really global in terms of wishing for a better world based on morality, justice, and so on.
I think that overview ties in very well into my next question, because I wanted to zoom out a bit and then look at those 7 tools, Katie, that you mentioned before. And the first one is know your history. And Ilan's just given us a great example of how the Zionist state has needed to sustain it, or how it's created, it needed to sustain itself and then deal with the resistance. But other of the tools, include having a critical mind, being able to deal with failure, and we're in a moment right now where it's bleak. We had Mahmoud Khalil being deported a couple of weeks ago. We've had the Trump plan, all these kind of these ways in which they're trying to normalize the insane plans, but they're trying to push it to the point in which it becomes normalized into conversation. So these tools are really quite important. But I wanted to ask all of you, if I may, these tools are important in terms of interpreting the world, but how can we intervene in it? Is it, as Angela Davis says, and as you've just said, Ilan, of international solidarity, of bringing it out of its national context and bringing it into international? Is it building coalitions, as you've done in the book? Is it building a counter knowledge? I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I puzzled over this question when you sent it to us, because I think we're kind of maybe I'll speak for myself personally, coming out of a time and a moment where I feel that the tools and the ideas and the ways forward, how they map onto action and like a better reality, a better world, it's felt very difficult to kind of follow those threads forward and to take those steps. But then I'm reminded, in thinking about how to respond to this question, that all of the tools are based on the conversations with these organizers, educators, scholars, like learned, amazing people who formulate these ideas based on action. So it's their lived experience, exactly. So it's not as if they're coming from the realm of like theory or idea and then, perhaps this might work. It's actually, this is their experience. These are the things that they've done, that they've tried, that they've failed at, that they've recalibrated, that they've tried again. So for me, there's something in that kind of that certainty that this isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from a history of action and investment. So I think that gives me hope, and it also like spurs me forward personally. But I'll speak again from my own experience. Like a really important place in which these tools can be actualized is in classrooms. So I work really closely with students, as does Ilan, as does Nadine, and it's in those spaces of learning and encounter and newness and questioning and refining that we take these tools and we move them forward, and they might take a different shape in a different context in response to a different challenge. But those are those educational spaces where risk is taken, where communication is prioritized, where we are thinking beyond the walls, ideally, of the classroom that we're sitting in, are absolutely crucial to making those tools work. And I'm really pleased that we're joined by some educators from Minneapolis, Minnesota tonight. My sister has traveled all the way over, and then Hans Verbeten, who she taught with in schools in Minneapolis, have reminded me, just their presence here reminds me it's not just those spaces of higher education at the university.
It can be the grass on the lawn of Exeter.
Absolutely. It can be in the encampment space, but it can also be in primary schools. It should be in primary schools. It should be in secondary schools. It should be in those spaces where children and young minds are coming. I mean, because they have to, but who do they encounter, and what is made possible within those spaces? And for me, that's a main place in which tools can be taken up, can be practiced, can be refined, and then can shape reality. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'll go next because mine is really not hopeful, and then hopefully Ilan can lift everyone up afterwards. I'm just not going to be effective at answering this question because I find it really difficult at the moment. I think like a lot of people, I think, to talk about active intervention. I mean, there are other people in the audience, people I recognize, people like Manal here, who I think would answer this question so much better because truly active person who I really admire for their energy and determination in the face of what is just unbearable, heartbreaking, soul-destroying onslaught. Honestly, what I feel is a deep sense of powerlessness, and that's something that I find kind of all-pervasive at the moment. I remember how we all called endlessly for ceasefire after October 7th, when all the horror we were witnessing was unfolding. We marched, we occupied stations, we did all these active things. We did everything we could do. You know, people set their bodies on fire and no one paid any attention. I think for me, this was like this moment of just utter desperation of just like this, nothing can shift. It doesn't matter even if we use the last thing that we have. And then it finally happened. There was this ceasefire in November for like a week. And I think the thing that truly broke me was just seeing how this violence could be turned on and off just like a tap was being turned on and off. It lasted a week. The tap was turned back on. And then it was the same relentless horror. And I think something broke in me at that point. Just this, that seeing kids playing outside in Gaza under clear blue skies, talking about how peaceful it was, how they weren't scared to play outside anymore for a few days, and then being driven mad with terror just a few days later, was something that I just, caused, I think, in me this like deep sense of just powerlessness in the face of some force that just feels just completely relentless. And, you know, when this last ceasefire was announced, I didn't believe it for a second. And of course, it was no ceasefire. We saw almost unprecedented levels of violence in the West Bank and displacement. And airstrikes continued anyway in Gaza. And of course, now we've seen what happened since. But what I will say, and I think in agreement with what Katie was just saying, is one thing I thought as well, is that I think what this book does and what we try to do in the conversations that we have and the work that we do in connecting the dots, trying to understand the violence, trying to make the connections between locations and points in history and now, is how you change minds and is how you build coalitions locally and globally. It is how you shift people. And one thing I try to hold on to is something that my friend, the poet Suna Khan, says, which is like, if you feel this overwhelm of powerlessness, like try to do one thing. Like active intervention doesn't have to be about, you know, building a mass movement that's going to be successful and that's going to change the world, but just try to do one thing. And so one thing that she is trying to do, for example, and is succeeding at doing, is she is bringing out this book of poems by this young woman poet in Gaza called Hayat. And I have the pleasure of having read her work and helping with the editing of this manuscript. And, you know, Hayat desperately wants to live. She desperately wants her little niece to live. She's terrified. She wants a future. She wants the world to read her words. You know, what Suna is doing and trying to bring her book out is, I think, active intervention. It's small scale, but it's doable and it's manageable, and it's something that I think can make us feel, I think, in the face of this powerlessness, like we're able to do something. And if anyone is interested in helping Hayat or talking to me about the book, I've got a QR code with me, which anyone can come to me afterwards and see more about the project and support her. So, I guess that's what I would say on active intervention.
Thank you. Ilan? Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, I'm not sure we can allow ourselves totally to immerse in powerlessness. I'm thinking about the children of Gaza that you hear about, you talk with, and they are so resilient in the face of what they are undergoing that we don't think we have the moral right to tell them that they are a lost case. I know. I know. No, I'm saying. Now I'm saying this is for me a very important, energizing kind of thing, and which forces me to think beyond what you absolutely right and objectively described, which is we probably don't have the power this year or next year to change the reality on the ground. And I would not say to anyone in Gaza or in the West Bank, don't worry, we're organizing something and in a year or two something will change. But I don't, and I genuinely believe in it when I say to them, but this bad period will pass. This will not be here forever. It's especially important to tell it to the children of Gaza and the children of Palestine, that this is not, we are not in the beginning of a bad period. We are at the end of a bad period.
Yes.
And that end is particularly ruthless, particularly cruel, as was the end of apartheid in South Africa, as was the end of French colonialism in Algeria. We have so many historical examples that actually evil regimes in their last days are particularly inhuman. Partly because there are processes that are breaking them down, that are disintegrating them. And therefore, I fully accept that one should never, create the impression that there is a chance for a dramatic change in the near future. But we should not be blind to processes which are probably slower in their progression, mature more, not as quickly as, unfortunately, the destruction on the ground. For instance, and I'm saying it with a lot of confidence, since 1882, Palestinians have never had such popular support in the world. Never. Millions and millions of people from Colombia to Pakistan to South Africa know where Palestine is, demonstrate for Palestine. Encampments were not only people think that encampments were only in the United States and United Kingdom. They were all over the world. And this means that while regimes and governments are part of the shield of immunity that allows Israel to continue the destruction, they are working against the wishes of many sections in their societies. And it's impossible to think that this gap between popular support for Palestine and the cruel complicity of so many governments in the world with the crimes against the Palestinians, I don't accept that this gap will always be there. And of course, we have to think all the time how to narrow the gap. I agree. The gap is there, and the gap disables a change on the ground. But it does not disable working to narrow it. Many of you, I'm sure, were in a demonstration of 1 million people for Palestine. And that was a very interesting demonstration, not only because of the numbers, but because of the composition of the people who were there. Different walks of life, different religions, secular people, religious people, and so on. This is a coalition that definitely can also one day become more political in terms of influencing things from above. There are two, and with this I will end. I think there are two processes here that carry with them a promise. Unfortunately, not for the near future, I'm afraid so. But they're carrying with them promise. One is the disintegration of the Zionist project. It's very clear for anyone who's there, everybody who's looking at it from the inside. It is crumbling. It's disintegrating. Historically, disintegration is a long process, unfortunately. It's not something that you meets the eyes immediately. It unfolds in stages. There are moments where the process is stopped because of certain development, but the trajectory is is linear in that respect towards collapse. And it's not only Palestine and Israel. Syria is collapsing. Lebanon is collapsing. The whole structure that the colonial powers have established after the First World War is collapsing. The whole idea of the Westphalian nation state imposed on the Eastern Mediterranean is not working. It's not working. But these are long historical processes. They don't, tomorrow, we won't wake up tomorrow for a new reality. So that's one process. The process which is chaotic, destructive, but also carries without the destruction of those who are destroyers. The other process, which is very slow and not organized enough and so on, are all of those who are thinking what should be instead of the crumbling building. Call it the day after, but not in the way that they talk about it.
I think Noam Chomsky touches upon this as well. He speaks about
Yeah.
this spiteful reflex.
Absolutely.
I guess it touches at the chaotic end, and I would call it a negative hope almost. It's still a hope, but it's relying on the other to
No,
implode.
but there's a difference here. The difference is that you are urging people, even under ethnic cleansing and genocide, to strategize,
Yes.
to envision the day after, not envision how the bad regime collapses. That's one thing.
Right.
But envision all the time and imagine all the time what would you like to be there instead, whether it's your right to return as a refugee, whether it's your wish to live as a normal person, whether it's a wish to be part of the Arab world. It doesn't matter. This is something that we are freezing, understandably, because we say, who wants to think about it under occupation, ethnic cleansing, and destruction? But it needs to be done because it will energize thinking. And there's one practical example for that. The fact that we don't have a proper organization that represents the Palestinians is something that very much disabled the solidarity movement with Palestine. And the fact there is no address that will tell the solidarity movement, this is what we would like you to do. This is our vision. You don't want someone from Ramallah to tell you what to do. I'm not sure you want everybody wants someone from Gaza, from the Hamas, to tell us what to do. We don't have the ANC of the Palestinians. We used to have it. And that also has to be rebuilt and not to be excused by saying, come on, this is no time for building organization, representation. No, it's not true. It's exactly the time. It's exactly the time for that.
Absolutely, and I think the way that I can bring it to a slightly more hopeful end is to talk about.
Go home now.
I want to talk about art and music.
Okay.
Well, it struck me during the 11-day assault on Gaza in 2021 that something did change. And I think it's kind of a fusion of a bit of how the book was planned and this kind of online spaces. But for the first time, I really saw, and I'm sure many of you in the audience were a part of it, was this on social media reconstituting a lot of things, whether that was people sharing, Kanafani's conversation between the sword and the neck, which now is periodical, or whether that's Platinum and Palestinian rap music, or people now finding out about Slimane Mansour. There's all these things that are now, and Ilan, you talk about global Israel versus global Palestine, and I look at the characters of the two, and global Palestine is global. Global Israel, to me, seems like a state, a government. That's how it kind of operates, right? And so, there was this real unity and defiance after 2021 that's continued to this day. And I think one of the ways that we've been able to, however difficult it's been, and however modest whatever we've done, whether that's the newspapers or with Muhammad al-Kurt's Perfect Victim, which Haymarket published. We saw those characters emerge from that period, and we're going to see more of these characters emerge, and that's something that Ilan, you just touched on, and I'm very pleased to say that Nadine's got a couple of poems that she would like to recite, and This wasn't about in 2021. These are about the current moment that we find ourselves in. But Nadine, if you'd like to recite, we'd be delighted to hear.
Sure. So yeah, I brought along 2 poems. I am also a poet as well as an academic. So the first one was written just before, well, just after October 7th, around that time. Ceasefire. In winter, the days are long. I've called away my voice from all but the sound of a single word. Searched for soulmates among the shrouds, learnt to love their afterlives. I've written letters to cowards, translated the dreams of the shaheed, contemplated suicide. I'm touching the houseplants more often, pressing the tips of my fingers to soil, taking their leaves like hands. And the second one, just to give some background, on the 24th of May 2000, after invading and occupying southern Lebanon for 18 years, the Israeli army suddenly withdrew. And when this happened, Palestinians who had been separated from their family members, those in refugee camps in Lebanon and those in Israeli-occupied Palestine, traveled to the border to meet each other, as did children who had been pen pals and who had never met each other. And this story is covered in a beautiful film by Mai Masri, Palestinian filmmaker. So this is Frontier. When the way was clear to the border, they traveled on buses for miles, stalked by soldiers spitting gun. The people paid them no mind, hearts set on seeing their land and meeting the strangers they loved. They called out surnames, held photographs 52 years old, passed prickly pears over razor wire, sacks of apples and bread. They loosened watches from their wrists, unclasped the gold from their necks. So you'll never forget me, I'll never forget you. They cupped the earth, filled pockets with home. Let me kiss you, said a boy to an uncle, and cocked his head, slid it clear of the metal spikes, pressed his lips to the old man's face. They clung to the border, their palms a perfect fit between the barbed parts of the wire, fingers finding that space between one threat and the next, as if peace were a resting place and freedom a thing to hold. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. That was really lovely. And I'd like to end this conversation before we move over to questions just on that. And I'd like to end it with something that Paul Gilroy said in the conversation with Ilan. And he talks about this poetic payoff. And I think, despite all the, sometimes you don't have words. Sometimes, you're stuck looking at a pen and paper and nothing's coming out. And it's actually, the poets, the artists that can create something new. As he says, there's something about how artists bring newness into the world in this very difficult and massively overdetermined area that suggests poets can summon and conjure with words and which are very extremely important. And so what Paul Gilroy speaks of is not just this ability to see differently. It's not, putting a different lens on it. It's actually that we can create something completely new. And as Nadine's work just showed. So thank you very much for the conversation. I'd now like to open up for questions, but thank you. Yeah, I don't think we will just, hands up, and then we will not pass the mic round, we'll just speak loudly.
Okay, thank you very much. One question, but before that, just a comment. The compañera here spoke about disillusionment, etc. I just want to put things in context, which goes to the topic that the compañero Pappé mentioned. There is, what's happening here is making history because there's one of the most important things we need to understand is to break the artificial division between the intellectuals and the street activists. And the book that you're doing and the effort you're doing coming here today is really making a fantastic contribution, because those of us who are on the streets doing activism also have to be educated, also have to do a lot of reading, just like the compañeros here also have to be in touch with the streets. So now I have a question. A compañero here spoke about Dubois. Dubois, his passport was taken by the Americans. He, such a personality, his passport was taken by the Americans. Shamima Begum, just a child that was abused here, her passport was taken. When they're doing it to the big celebrity or to someone who's just a child in this country, they're thinking about all of us. That's what they got in mind. And then the question was, what is it that we do to change the world? It's not just about Palestine, it's about the kind of world we want to be. So the question is, what is the opinion of the panelists regarding the position of the Colombian government, which cut off relations with Israel, does not recognize Israel, it recognizes Palestine in the borders of 1948, and whether one of the things that we can do, one of the many, is to lobby for the United Kingdom to stop recognizing Israel and to recognize Palestine instead. What is the position of the compañeros here? Thank you.
Stand up and speak, I think. Do you want to just stand up and speak?
I'd like to direct a question at Ilan Pappé. I'm really interested. You made a comment that was about a representation of the Palestinian people's wishes, desires, thoughts for their future. You mentioned that they don't have that voice now, but that they had it before. Who are you referring to that represented their voice? I'm wondering.
Third question.
Thanks, guys. That was fascinating. Just to give a bit of context, I've been running grief vigils for Gaza for the past few months, since December, and on Clapton Common monthly. And the overwhelming sense I get from a lot of people who attend is that there's a feeling that something bigger than politics is needed to address this situation. You talked about taking moral authority from wherever we can to help advance this movement. I'm curious what the panel's opinions might be on building coalitions with faith movements, even like an interfaith movement. I noticed that in history, broadly, you have faith movements like Martin Luther King, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Thich Nhat Hanh involved in civil rights, completely moved mountains. And I think there's also, I just noticed how hostile the right-wing press is, particularly to progressive and protest movements in this country. But the other day when they bashed down the door of a Quaker meeting house in central London, even the Daily Mail was ranting about it. I just think there's so much common ground between all those groups, and I feel like there might be I think there's a bit of an open goal to be had there about building coalitions with Christian groups, Jewish groups, Islamic groups. So I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts might be on that.
I'll start. First of all, I like being called a compañero. I can already go home. I was never a compañero, but it resonates with Che Guevara and all this thing. I'm glad I lived long enough to get to this moment. Okay, now more seriously, I think it's very important that a state, and not just a society, in the global south, such as Colombia, was very clear in its attitude. Not a wishy-washy kind of reaction, but one that reminded us of different cases in history where regimes were totally boycotted and unaccepted by states. So that is very important. I don't know if we can do it in Britain, as you said, probably not. But Britain would not be the first in the line. There are still countries in the global south that at least Colombia should try and recruit. One of the things that Zionism always wanted to do and Israel is doing is to convince the Arab states to normalize the idea that a Jewish European state at the heart of the Arab world is something that benefits the Arab world as well. And therefore normalization in that respect means normalizing the occupation, the apartheid, settler colonialism. Nobody should sell us the story that normalization is about bilateral peace between Israel and Arab states. It's not. It's normalizing the oppression of the Palestinians and the Israeli Zionist attempt to expunge Palestine altogether as an idea, as a country, and as a nation. So I think it would be great if given also what Nadine said about the international law, the lack of confidence in the global south in international law, the whole idea that we're not sure anymore what is universal, and so on, if there would be a coalition of countries that at least are not restricted by a history of what happened in Europe in the Second World War and so on, to begin there, with the countries who are much likely to overcome any accusation of anti-Semitism, or nobody can remind them, what did you do to the Jews in the Second World War, and by that silencing them. So that's the compañero thingy. As for the question of who represented the Palestinians, well, the PLO until 1982, until it was pushed, or its headquarters were pushed to Tunis, was representing fully the Palestinian people. And in fact, the idea that they subscribe to is the one that many of us are trying to revive, the idea of one democratic state between the river and the sea, and the right of return of the refugees. Sometimes you don't have to invent the wheel. I think the program of the PLO was a program that reflected very well a very logic, moral, and democratic response to the dispossession of Palestine, as Edward Said used to call it. And I do hope that we will have a revised PLO, something different. It doesn't matter. The third comments, I do agree. I think that, first of all, when you build coalitions, you have to be less purist. You have to be pragmatic. I think because the basic solidarity movement with the Palestinians in the 1970s was based on the left, there is still a kind of a sense that if you're not in the left, you cannot be part of the solidarity with the Palestinians. Well, the Palestinians cannot afford this luxury to be saved only by the left. And I think that one of the things that really brought to the fore the most powerful representation of the wish of people to show solidarity with Palestinians is the connection between Muslim and Arab communities in the West and the left. That is the formula that created a sense of solidarity that we didn't even have in the 1970s. So it shows you, first of all, that people who are very strong in their belief about Islam and the Muslim identity, and the people who care for whatever reason it is about Palestine, can work together. It's a synergetic effort that makes a difference. And I agree, we should go further than that. So your idea is very welcome, I think, for that. Surely, if you have a moral point of view on humanity, whether it is anchored in your religious faith or in your universal humanist faith or your Buddhist faith, it doesn't matter. You cannot be indifferent to what's happening to the Palestinians. You can talk to ultra-Orthodox Jews of Neturei Karta, and they would say to you, this is nothing to do. People say to us, oh, you think that this is not Jewish or not good. They say, we live in Jerusalem, 10 kilometers from the killing fields of the West Bank. How can we be silent about it? This has nothing to do with our Judaism. This has nothing to do with our ideas about Zionism. This has to do with our ideas about being a human being. So yes, I do think that there is a lot to be said for that. It's very, very sad to see leaders such as Dalai Lama and the Pope, who represent, powerful religious institution, are censored, self-censored in the same way as presidents, prime ministers, and so on. So we need to find the structures in those communities that is also willing to challenge those who seem to hold the most important position in the religious hierarchy, and so on. Yeah, but that's a very good idea.
That's your mic.
That's my mic.
I think just to that point, I think of liberation theologies as well, which are grounded in various faiths, as being really instructive in this moment, and they have been historically in anti-colonial struggles as well. So there's so much learning to be done by becoming aware of and then acquainted with what are these different orientations which are faith-based. And during the encampments, at the height of the encampments, which, as you rightly say, were not just in the United States or in the UK, but really around the world, some of the images that were coming through were, I remember at some of the US institutions in particular, Jewish students who were part of the encampments sharing like the Sabbath with other members of the encampment across faiths. And this real kind of moment of introspection that publications like Jewish Currents made legible, made knowable through the courage of their editor, like Ariella Angel, where there was and continues to be a questioning of what it means to be Jewish in a time of genocide. And I think that, again, that speaks to what are the questions that faith and heritage and tradition, which is a word I'm uncomfortable with, but to some extent it works here. What are the questions that those roots, those anchors compel us to ask, and then what does that compel us to do? So I agree with you and with Ilan that the possibility here, and in thinking about coalitions as not as pragmatic, like acts of building and creating, and that there's a possibility there that absolutely will be key to building something bigger. And perhaps that kind of links back to the first question that was asked about the position of the Colombian government in thinking about the examples that we have when we learn our history, when we make connections, when we ask these questions. And as Ilan said, the example of a state taking this position and strongly so, visibly so on a global stage is instructive. Again, it does perhaps embolden others to act or to position themselves similarly. And even if not now, perhaps in the future. And it makes me think as well of other kinds of initiatives, like this kind of, despite the repression that we're seeing in the US and the slashing of funding, the persecution and deportation of student activists, and the list goes on, that there are kinds of sentiments in institutional settings within universities that things that were taken for granted, for example, the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, now is the time to question that and to start to think about, well, in which other contexts, in which other settings has it been questioned? Has the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism perhaps been adopted as a lens through which to understand the IHRA as a step toward a much more inclusive definition of anti-racism that also holds Islamophobia, for example? So I think these examples and this sharing of precedent, of struggle, of strategy, and connecting the dots again is really important. And it reminds me of something Angela Davis said actually in the Q&A to her conversation with Ilan, which is included in the introduction, where she speaks about shifting the language. And well, she was working really with the earliest group of scholar activists on abolitionism and this movement that drew attention to what are the conditions that create the carceral reality in the United States as it is today, they crafted this language of a prison industrial complex, which we now use, we now hear, we see and we name that reality, those structures, that violence, using that language. And again, I think the power of example, from states to language to organizing against the adoption or the ratification of particular policies.
When they crafted it, they thought it would never be mainstream.
Yes.
It would never be used outside of their small circle, that it would never travel, which is also amazing. That makes it worth, like what Ilan was saying, is imagining task which feels impossible when the oppression is happening.
Yes.
That's like an example of it actually, taking off. Yeah. Sorry.
No, well said. And that, I'll hand to you.
No, I have nothing further.
I'm done.
I'm
Thank you, Nadine.
I also have nothing. I think you both covered those questions amazingly. So I don't know if we have time for any more, but I don't want to take up.
I think we'll wrap up. I just want to leave you all with something that Khalil, our protagonist in Bab al-Sham, says at the end, in which he implores everyone, not to ossify, don't be rigid, don't stop, just keep moving. And I think if this conversation is anything to go by, then there are better days ahead. So thank you very much, everyone.
That was a recording of Palestine in a World on Fire, chaired by the New Arab, myself, Benjamin Ashraf, alongside Ilan Pappé and Katherine Natanel and Nadine El-Enany at Reference Point on the 4th of April 2025. For more news, analysis, opinion and features from the Arab world and beyond, check out the New Arab website and all of our social media links.